Could you stand up? It helps us all. Thank you.
Could you just give us some of your thoughts on the current problems between Russia and Ukraine?
Well, let's distinguish Crimea from Ukraine. Right? The Russian takeover of Crimea was obviously in violation of international law. And when the West condemns the violation of international law, it's correct. But as usual, there are a few other things to think about. So yes, that's in violation of international law. It doesn't compare with what the U.S. does with British support. So for example, take Eastern Cuba, okay? 100 years ago, 110 years ago, the U.S. took over Eastern Cuba, it's what we call Guantanamo. Eastern Cuba by force. Cuba was invaded by the U.S. forces. The guise was liberation. It was actually conquest. Cuba was compelled at gunpoint to hand over Eastern Cuba to the United States. When Cuba finally gained independence in 1959, it tried to get it back, but the U.S. refused, holds on to it. It uses it, as you know, as a torture chamber, as a place to confine people that don't know what to do with, and so on. It's also preventing the development of Cuba. It's one of the main reasons for keeping it. It contains Cuba's main port, which points towards Europe for trade. So the main purpose for the last 50 years has been essentially to impede the development of Cuba, part of the whole embargo system. That's much worse than the takeover of Crimea. I mean, Crimea, I don't think it's justifiable, but you can give some reasons for it. In the case of the takeover of Eastern Cuba, the sole reason you can give is to undermine Cuban independence and development. Okay, so if you condemn the takeover of Ukraine, that's fine, of Crimea, but then let's add that the takeover of Eastern Cuba is much worse. Okay, what about the Russians in Ukraine? That's a complicated story. In fact, there's an article in the main establishment journal, Foreign Affairs, a lead article, a couple of issues back, by John Mearsheimer, the leading international relations specialist. And notice that this is mainstream establishment I'm talking about, not on the left. The article is called "The West is Responsible for the Ukraine Crisis." And what Mearsheimer points out is that going back to roughly 1990, when the Russian Empire collapsed, there were questions about how should the post-war system develop. Gorbachev made a remarkable concession. He agreed to allow unified Germany to join a Western military alliance. You think about history, that's pretty astonishing. Germany alone had practically destroyed Russia a couple of times in the century. Now he was saying unified, militarized Germany can join a hostile military alliance. There was a quid pro quo, a condition that NATO would not move, the phrase was, 1 inch to the east. That meant East Germany, okay? So NATO would not move to East Germany. That was the quid pro quo. NATO immediately moved to East Germany. Gorbachev was pretty upset, but he was informed by President Bush, Bush #1, and James Baker, Secretary of State, that this was just a verbal agreement. There was nothing on paper. And the implication, they didn't say it, but the implication is if you're dumb enough to accept a verbal gentleman's agreement with the United States, that's your problem. So NATO moved, he didn't say that, I'm adding it. NATO moved to East Germany. Clinton came in, NATO moved further towards the right, to the borders of Russia, all the way along. Actually, a question that we ought to be asking ourselves is why did NATO even exist after 1990? Throughout the whole history of the Cold War, we were told NATO is necessary to defend Western Europe from the Russian hordes, okay? No more Russian hordes. What happens to NATO? It expands, okay? It expands to the east. Its mission changed. Its official mission now is not to defend Europe from the Russian hordes. It's to control the global energy system, sea lanes and pipelines, and to serve as a US-run intervention force. Well, you know, we're all educated intellectuals. We can now ask a question. What was the nature of the propaganda we were fed all those years? I mean, if NATO was there to defend the West from the Russians, why is it now expanding right to the borders of Russia, becoming a global US intervention force, protecting sea lanes and pipelines and so on? What that tells us is all the talk about the Cold War was just a pure lie. And there's plenty more evidence for that, which we could go into. Educated intellectuals don't pursue this line of thought, but it's a pretty obvious one. Well, going on to Ukraine, Mearsheimer's point is that for any Russian leader, whoever it might be, you know, Mahatma Gandhi, Ukraine is right at the core of their geostrategic concerns. For Ukraine to be taken into NATO, which is what is repeatedly threatened, would be a very serious threat to Russian security, quite apart from historical interests, which go way back, the origins of the Russian Empire, in fact. So yeah, you can give arguments against Russian interference in eastern Ukraine after the coup that took place there, but it's a complicated story, and the West is not without its significant initiatives there.